Community Theatre in Middletown. And this is the interviewer, Ed Strother, and today I'm talking with Earl Williams. Earl and I are seated at this particular moment in his office down in the lower lounge or lobby of Emmons Auditorium. The date is July 24th, 1985. And the first question I have, Earl, is what is your earliest recollection of Muncie Civic Theatre?
Well, I was a junior in high school, and I tried out just as a young student from the high school theater department for the play Life with Father, because the word went out they needed young children in the show. And so I tried out and got the part of the oldest brother in Life with Father. Irene Belcher was the mother, Bob Poorman was the father, Alan Getchus and his brother were cast as younger brothers in the show, and Marjorie Hampton was the sister. And I can remember a very elegant set was prepared. We had a French provincial couch, and that's the couch that was used for a tintype picture that was taken in color in about 1944-45.
Somewhere in there.
When I was a junior in high school. I remember I had to ride the bus, and I had to have my hair tinted. I had blonde hair. I had hair then. I had blonde hair, and it was tinted red. And that did not go over too well on the bus and at school. When all of a sudden I showed up at school with red hair, somebody thought I'd lost something.
You'd become a creep or something.
Well, that's right, because not too many kids had an opportunity. There's not too many parts that you could participate in, and Life with Father, as I can remember back, maybe I'm boasting a little bit, went over very well. It was with Irene and with Bob Poorman as the parents. So it was a strong cast.
Well, you had to have a teacher at Muncie Central who encouraged you to get down there.
The person teaching theater, there were one teaching speech also, a speech and theater teacher, Eleanor Bly.
Yes.
And her name was Henrietta Brandt. That was a theater teacher.
I knew them both. I knew them both. And they were both very vibrant people.
They were. And
I think I knew Eleanor Bly a little better.
A great lady. And
Yes.
they're both living, and I've seen both of them in the last few years. And they still remember activities.
Well, beyond Life with Father, did you get roped into any other show down there?
After that, I remember after the war, after World War II, pardon me, they came back and they did Stalag 17, and Ed Langus was cast in that show.
Yes.
And the big debate on that show was whether at the final line, when they blow up the prison, the fellows escaped, was whether or not Ed Langus was going to say the SOB did it. And it was either going to be the words or the initials.
Yeah.
And that debate was on again, off again, and Ed Langus had returned from the service, and Ed Langus said, I'm going to say it, and he did. And I think that's the first time that a major word like that
had a breakthrough.
Right.
Well, was there any kickback?
No.
The clergy didn't object?
No, it fit into the play. He said, after all, it's a bunch of prisoners in a prison, and that's exactly what would have been said. And I don't remember any problem at all. We were more worried about it than the reaction than anybody else.
Well, the Ed Langus I knew, he would have insisted on that.
Right,
He
and Ed was playing the lead part in that.
Yes. Well, how about high school? When you worked with Eleanor Bly or Henrietta, do you recall any of the high school days or high school shows?
No, I never participated in a high school play. I always worked after school and on Saturdays, and so I really never was involved in
Well, it's
plays.
good to know you were enterprising a lot.
So I went on to Civic Theatre.
Yeah.
Bigger and better things.
Well, I know that sometime after that, that particular show, you got involved here at the university. And I don't know, that maybe should come last, but I'll put it right now. And that is, at the present time, you are manager of the Emmons College Community Auditorium here. Will you tell us a little bit about how that big auditorium, and marvelous auditorium, I might say, really got its start?
After President Emmons came to Ball State, this was again in the late 40s there, he was asked to lay out a long-range plan for a growing, at that time, teachers' college, which would someday be an emerging university. What would be needed in the way of facilities and program and things of that nature? And Ball State at that time had the Assembly Hall, which I'm sure you well remember.
Yes,
An 1,100-seat flat floor, big stage auditorium, 1,100-seat Assembly Hall. And then also they did concerts in the men's gym, or the ball gym.
Right.
And they used to complain about, I know, I can still hear the stories from people when Isaac Stern played here, and the radiators were cracking and popping over.
Now this is Assembly Hall.
In the gym at that time, because there were so many people wanted to hear Isaac Stern. You had over 1,100 people, you had to go to the gym. And they did some symphonies and things there. So through the years, that's where the things were held on Ball State. And then Civic Music of Muncie would hold their concerts either in Assembly Hall or the gymnasium. Even to the extent that before this building was built, Irene Belcher and Walter Harker and Irene's husband Doug held what they call the Star Showcase, and they brought in a few performers like Hal Holbrook did Mark Twain. They brought in the San Francisco Ballet. These things were horrendous risk for individuals to take, and bless their heart, they had such a dedication. They signed the contracts and brought them in. But anyway, the programs were being held in those two facilities, and one of the things that President Emmons said in his long-range plan, and it was really a dream of his, was that we need a large building or facility for the performing arts. And he thought of it as a multi-performing arts, which would include music and theater and dance. It would have been nice if we could have one for each of the arts or each of the disciplines, but through the 50s, it was determined that we needed to build one large building, and it would serve all of the major arts, the performing arts. And in the late 50s, the Cleveland Orchestra played in the Assembly Hall, which was part library, part Assembly Hall. And George Zell, the conductor of the Cleveland Orchestra, had a conversation with President Emmons, and Emmons told him, someday we hope to have a nicer, newer facility. And he said, if you ever build a building, then you need to get a man by the name of Heinrich Keilholz to design it from an acoustical standpoint. He's a German acoustician, and he had rebuilt many of the halls in Europe after the bombing out in the Second World War. So we came along in the late 50s, and it was recognized that Ball State University, being a state institution or state partially supported by the state, could not build a building by themselves because a state university is not permitted to build a building that classes are not held in with state appropriated money. And so we had to build it in another fashion. Well, at that time, and it's proven to be very accurate, the university couldn't build it by itself. The community needed a building likewise, but individually they could not build a facility, maintain it, and operate it, and program it. And so it was President Emmons' idea, let's join together with the community, raise half the money for whatever the building's going to cost out of contributions, a capital gifts campaign, and the other half of the money we will pay off on a 20-year bond issue out of student fees and building income. And that was his dream and his plan, and he conceived the entire thing. And so it got started in the early, like in 61 and 60 and 61, 62 along in there, that we brought in a professional fundraising company, and Carl Glazer was the man's name, and we went to the community, and we had a community committee, and actually at that time some advanced planning went into that. The structure itself, the English building had been built. 2 years later, the state appropriated money for the English building, and that was placed appropriately on the other side with space in the middle. And then 2 years after the English building, they built the theater wing, which connected the two in the back, as you remember. And that was done in over 3 biennium appropriations from the legislature. Anyway, this was all planned, the 3 phases of the building, and then the architect had planned to put the auditorium down in the middle. He told us at that time we saved better than $1 million in building cost because we had 3 walls up, and then we had many utility lines stubbed into the building. We had the loading dock built and things of that nature. This building, the whole complex, was actually on the plan in the late 40s that the architect conceived. Only one change was made in it, and that was instead of the building facing west, which would have been Riverside, they turned it, as the campus developed to the north, they turned it around so it would face Riverside. I'm sorry, the original way it was going to face was McKinley, which would have been to the west. They turned it around and faced it south and had it face Riverside. That's the only change made in it. So anyway, we raised the money, and
do you recall how much?
The original campaign, and Ralph Whiting was the general chairman. The original campaign pledged over a 3-year period $1,200,000. The goal was $1.5 million, and with Ralph Whitinger's knowledge and his just complete positive outlook and his leadership, really. He said, this community can raise our goal, but let's go ahead and start the building. And they did in 1962. They had the groundbreaking ceremony. And he said, in the next year or 2, we'll go out and raise the other $300,000. Mm-hmm. And I know I said in Ralph's office several times, and that man is hard to describe because he's done so much for this community in Ball State, but he knew how to organize it, and he literally raised that $300,000. In fact, it was finally $310,000 that they raised. So it was $1.5 million they raised.
Well, you were on that campaign group too.
Right.
What was your...
I was in a working capacity. I would take the slides out and show them to industry groups and teacher groups and any sororities and organizations that we could show it. And we set up payroll deduction programs in about 40 businesses where people would donate maybe $1 or $2 or $5 a pay period. Mm-hmm. And it came in, and in the end, Ralph and the leadership was very amazed at the high return of pledges that ended up being paid.
Yeah.
And then the other $1.5 million has been paid off, in fact, a couple years early. So the building was paid off in 18 years, just as planned.
Well, now, correct me if I'm wrong here, Earl, but the way I remember that campaign, I would have to say before the campaign ever got started, the students here at the university, at the college at that time, were so eager to have another or better performance
mm-hmm.
space, or so eager to have Assembly Hall all its own, that they had a special production that I remember being a 7-year itch, mm-hmm. and they wanted to give the entire proceeds to the Emmons College Community Auditorium Fund. And Dr. Baum, who was in charge of business affairs or something, public affairs at that time, had to take it under consideration whether or not the gift would be accepted. Do you remember that being the first gift?
Well, as I recall the story and all that, to actually say it wasn't the first gift or not, I really don't know that far back. But there was some concern that from the fundraiser at that time that would a lot of people think that if I bought a ticket, I supported the fund drive.
Yeah.
And he was a little concerned about activities and events where a person might buy a $2 or $3 or $4 ticket, where he was wanting them to contribute money.
Well, I think our tickets were $1.
Yeah. So he had a little concern that way, that people would think of it as a capital gifts type thing, and whether or not it was accepted or not, I can't remember. Yeah. But
well, it was finally accepted. Let me ask you.
There was great support, I'll tell you, from the community. It was a unique story at that time, Ed, because a lot of people had contributed to hospitals and buildings for health and things of this nature, but it was rather a first across the country to get people to contribute to a building for the arts.
That's right. And
there were a lot of concerns in the community. Well, if it's built on the campus, will I ever get to use it, or can we use it? And how do I know you'll just not keep it for your own use? And really, I didn't know at the time I was going to be involved in the management of it, but we really worked hard to get people to feel comfortable to come in the building. And that's one reason why we try to put a variety of shows in here. We'll do country shows. We'll do bluegrass shows. We'll do gospel shows with the thought in mind of maybe appealing to some people in parts of the community who've never been in a building.
Yeah. What is the biggest thing coming up for the next year?
The biggest thing coming up this year, will be the biggest thing we've ever had, is 42nd Street.
Oh.
It's the Broadway musical. It was a hit 3 years ago and is still playing. To show you how these things grow, the shows used to come in a truck, one semi-truck, and one bus for the cast and orchestra. 42nd Street, they've told us now, is going to be in 5 semi-trucks, and these trucks are bigger than they were when we started the building.
Heavens, yeah.
5 trucks. It's going to take about 38 men to unload and bring in the shows and to hang it. It's going to take about 8 to 10 hours to put the show up, and probably 4 to 5 hours to take it out. It'll have the biggest cast. They have 3 buses of personnel, of orchestra, cast, and crew. So it's the all-time biggest.
Is it fair to ask how much that's costing?
Well, I'll show you how times have changed. Back when we booked Fiddler on the Roof, which was one of the very first musicals.
And it was a big one.
It was a big one. It was $7,000 for the show. And this will be $37,500. So you can see, sure, inflation and royalties have gone up and truck costs and all these things.
Sure.
But instead of the ticket being $4 or $5 as it was then, it's going to be $18.
I see.
And
that's cheap compared to New York.
Well, I paid $45 to see 42nd Street, and it's a great production. It's
and
a
here
family
in Middletown,
show.
USA, it is $18.
Right, and a person just told me they came back from Arizona and they saw it advertised in Phoenix at $32. And this is the same company we will have. It'll be in January. The thing we have to pray for is clear roads and clean highways, because and the other interesting thing about that show is they can only book it a few miles apart, because they have to start unloading it at 8 o'clock in the morning. And they won't get out of the prior night until about 4 o'clock.
Yeah.
And so it's going to come up here from Bloomington.
Well, it's a big jump from from 42nd Street to that particular show back to the time when you were on the board at Civic Theatre, or let's talk about the time when you were president of the board of Civic Theatre. Do you recall about when that was?
Yes, because I was involved with the transition from moving from the Masonic Temple to buying or going on a mortgage to buy the present Civic Theatre building. And it was challenging, it was difficult. We had people on the board who said, we've always been here and there's no reason to move. We had people arguing, but to move forward, we have to do new and bigger things. And we cannot go into debt for all of that building. We can't.
Well, who were the most eloquent spokesmen for either of those two sides?
Well, 2 or 3 people that were on the board and involved in making a decision have contributed a great deal to Civic Theatre. Helen Myers, bless her heart, has contributed so much to Civic Theatre. She was one of the ones saying, but we can't do it.
Right.
And Helen was a very stable person to have through the years.
Yeah.
And then I can remember Irene Belcher being a progressive person saying, but we've got to go try that. We've got to go do it.
Right.
And when we started thinking about mortgages and debt and hardly having any money at all, it was a horrendous gamble. But Irene was a pusher and a mover to move there. Betty Henshaw, as I can recall, wanted to move on to our own home. And we would have the scheduling of the whole building whenever we wanted it.
Yeah.
Those are some personalities that I would say and credit with contributing a lot to the very success that Civic Theatre has had, because they've been very stable people.
Well, there were a number of theaters, cinema houses that were vacant at that time, and I do recall that you went around to a number of them. What were the leading possibilities for theaters, for homes?
Well, that was the leading one. As I recall, the Weiser Grand was still in existence, but it was too far gone. Really, it had 2 balconies, and it just wasn't
Was
of
the
course,
asking price too much?
I can't remember. I don't remember what the asking price was. In fact, I can't remember the asking price of the present building, the old Star Theater. But the Strand didn't have an appropriate stage. It was just really a movie house.
That's
and the
right.
Rivoli had a stage. It was just too big. We could not operate anything like that. And it was still successfully going as a movie house.
Yeah.
So it kind of just limited itself down to the present building. And it's proven out to be a good decision, I think. And then I think Irene Belcher followed me as president. But the thing that I think has kept Civic Theater going, and I think that enters into our discussion here through the years and successful, is that if you look at some organizations, nonprofit, whatever their objective or purpose may be, you get a group of people in who will serve in a very dedicated way for a few years. And that'll vary 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 years, and then they may be burnt out. But Civic Theater has been fortunate, really fortunate, with having people like Irene Belcher and her husband Doug, who came down and spent hundreds of hours. Helen Myers spent literally hundreds and devoted her life. And Helen wasn't an actress. She was behind the scenes lady.
That's right. She rolled up carpets.
She did, and she'd do anything. And it was an outlet for her. The two who really had the theatrical interest and background and acting and all that was, of course, Betty Hinshaw and Irene Belcher. And those ladies, through the years, contributed so much to the success and continuity of Civic Theater. And we had people like that. Then we had another echelon of people. Today we have Gladys Ahern that does this. And she's devoted hundreds of hours to it. And those things have really been factors. Those kinds of people have been factors. Then we've had another echelon of people. Again, maybe there were backstage people, Ruth Maddox, Helen Schilling in the box office. We've had people who devoted maybe a number of years, but not the long continuity like Helen and Betty and Irene. It sticks in my mind. Then we had some real good men, too, that would, Bob Horman, Harcourt Morrow, Ed Langus, Marty Swartz. These people, over the years, as their jobs and lifestyle and occupation all allowed for it, they made real good contributions. And so we had that echelon of people who would do it for a few years. And then those same people, through the years, have been willing to accept new people. Now, Civic or any other organization always gets the criticism, well, the new people have a chance, and they have. And the last few years have shown that. And so I think you put those things together, and Civic has a lot of things going for it because of this dedication of these people. Hard work.
Well, I know you're serving right about the time they acquired a new home, that is the Star Theater there on Main Street. Were there any other critical issues that you recall?
Well, there were those on the board that, because of our limitations at the Masonic Temple, said we cannot do a musical. Helen was one. Irene said we could. And there were others who wanted to. You can't do it because we've never done it before. You can't get an orchestra in that little space down there in front of the stage. You can't do much in the way of flying of scenery. You have to have one set show like you can in a play. You can't get that many voices, men or women. We can't get dancers. There were all kinds of reasons why you couldn't do it. The royalties were so much more than on a play. And so there were so many, in their own mind, logical arguments why you can't do a musical. Well, in the Masonic Temple, it would have been extremely difficult with flying and all the space and things like that. So when we moved to the Star Theater, that was one of the first things that the people got excited about, and you had people on both sides of the coin saying, you can't do it, you'll go broke, and those others saying, but we'll have a bigger audience. Yeah. And as I remember, it was Pajama Game.
Yes.
The first musical.
That's the way I remember.
Nothing but success.
Yes.
Nothing but success. But we had, the other thing about moving into that building you asked about, I can remember the number of people that came down and volunteered their help just to clean it up. Jack Reichert said, I'll take care of getting the chandeliers, and they had those made at Excel.
Yes.
I mean, the wall fixtures. And I remember being on scaffolding down there with Dick Bump. The problem with Dick Bump is he stood on one end of the board and I stood on the other, and he got off of one end of the board. But we were painting up under the balcony.
Yeah.
And we had people from all over town down there painting or making covers for the seats. It was like a swarm of ants came into that building and cleaned it in a short period of time, and volunteer help.
Yes.
And that's the kind of spirit that has made Civic Theater successful, to the tune that we can now, 55 years later, have a good, successful fundraising drive.
That's right. And as we learned at noon today, that fundraising drive is coming along very well. What did Brian say?
It's over $200,000 in that range, and we're well into over half the time period gone. So the $300,000 goal is looking very attainable, and it's just generating a whole new enthusiasm and support, not only in bodies and attendance. The new membership sale is up. Yeah. And you can look across some community theaters across the country, and they've had splinter groups break off, and they've had problems within them, and they've lost money, and they've broken up. And amazing, after 54 or 5 years here, we're probably going as strong as ever.
I think you're right. Well, that's a good place for us to sign off. This is Ed Strother, who has been talking with Earl Williams on July 24th, 1985, about community theater in Middle.